Hi, everybody. Today I want to share some thoughts with you on the subject of the pressure to bend. The pressure to bend. Now, the Bible talks about the pressure to bend in a number of different ways. In fact, in the book of Proverbs, a paraphrase says this. It says, "Honesty lives confident and carefree, but shifty is sure to be exposed." Today I'm talking about compromise and how tempting it is to bend when difficulties come your way and my way. Will Rogers said one time, he said, "Lead your life so you wouldn't be ashamed to sell your family parrot to the town gossip." Think about that a minute. How many things have gone on in your house and my house that maybe we wouldn't want to share with the public too much? Over in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, way back in 600 or so BC, there's a story about a young man who was challenged to not bend. Let me just share a part of that story in Daniel chapter 1. It says, "In the third year of the reign of this particular king in Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, who was king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem to besiege it. The Lord gave this king of Judah into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to this other land and to the house of his small g God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury. So he plundered Jerusalem and took a lot of the holy objects to his part of the world. Then the king ordered this individual, the chief of his army, to bring in some of the sons of Israel. That is the wise people that he took captive from Jerusalem. So in verse 4, he was asking for youths with no defect at all. And they were good looking and showing some sort of intelligence. And they were endowed with understanding. And they wanted to have these people around the king to give him advice. This is the whole story. In verse 5, it says, "So the king appointed for them a daily ration of the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated for 3 years," the story says. "And at the end, they were to enter the king's service." So they found these wise young men, just a few of them, and trained them for 3 years to serve the king in his role. So the king had these few guys, and one of the guys' name is Daniel, and the other guy is Belshazzar and Hananiah and Shadrach. So the king changed their names into the language of his part of the world, his region, which was in the Iraq area of that time. Now in verse 8, it gets interesting. It says this, "But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank." So think about this a minute. Let me just pause here. These individuals, among thousands of other people, were taken captive, and they were told to do certain things. They were told to eat certain foods. They were told to drink certain things from this king who didn't worship the God that Daniel worshiped over in Jerusalem. So in the same verse, in verse 8, it says, "So Daniel sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor," listen, "and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials." So because he was respectful and yet he did not compromise, he was able to, and at the end of the story, he was able to do right not only by his integrity, but also to serve the king in a very dramatic way. So you see sometimes that, as Chuck Swindoll said, if Daniel wanted to abstain from eating and drinking what the king provided, he could have gone through it a number of different ways. He could have thrown it away when no one was looking and maybe sneaked other food from the palace. And he could have made arrangements or bribed the kitchen staff, but he didn't choose to do that. He again, in Daniel 1, verse 8, it says he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. He was unbending. He had integrity. He had honor. He had courage. And I wonder how many times people you know have been tempted to take shortcuts when really shortcuts were not necessary at all, because they knew that if they would do it the right way, it might take a little longer to get done what you needed done, but certainly it wasn't as difficult as they might think. Again, Proverbs says this, "He who walks with integrity walks securely, but he who perverts his ways will become known." Think about that a minute. Integrity always wins. It might not win in the way you and I think, or might not win the way you and I expect, but in time, integrity does win. During his time as a rancher, Theodore Roosevelt and one of his cowpunchers lassoed a maverick steer. They lit a fire and prepared the branding irons. The part of the range that we're on was claimed by Gregor Lane, one of Roosevelt's neighbors. And according to the cattleman's rule, the steer therefore belonged to the neighbor, George or Gregor. And his cowboy applied the brand, but Roosevelt said, wait a minute, wait. Shouldn't this be the neighbor's brand? That's all right, boss, said the cowboy, but you're putting on my brand, Roosevelt said. That's right, said the man. Drop that iron, Roosevelt demanded, and get back to the ranch and get out. I don't need you anymore, he said. A man who will steal for me will steal from me. You know, you can tell a lot about a person by their actions, not only by their words, because you can learn a lot also about people's words, but you can definitely learn more about the actions of people based on what they do, not only what they say. Merritt Malloy writes, compromise is simply changing the question to fit the answer. Again, compromise is simply changing the question to fit the answer. Again, and over in Daniel, Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself. And I wonder if sometimes you and I are tempted to take shortcuts to get to a place in our lives that maybe if we would take the long route, it would take too long, at least in our own minds. Joyce Meyer said one time, compromise means to go just a little bit below what you know is right. Again, compromise means just to go a little bit below what you know is right. Chuck Swindoll shares a story. He says, when Ralph Houck was manager of the New York Yankees, baseball schedules were even more exacting than they are now. With doubleheaders almost every week, occasionally a player would get sick of the grind and approach Houck and asking for the permission to set out a game. I know how you feel, the manager said generally, and sure, take this day off, but do me a favor. You're in the starting lineup, just play one inning. Then skip the rest of the game. So the player would honor Houck's request and almost invariably get caught up in the spirit of the game and play it out to the end. I wonder how many times you and I are tempted to just go halfway or not even really get started when we're supposed to stay in the game to the end. In Romans chapter 12, the New Testament of the Bible says this. Actually, it's a paraphrase of this text. It says, so here's what I want you to do. God helping you take your everyday, ordinary life, you're sleeping, you're eating, you're going to work and walking around life and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for Him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even really thinking about it. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what He wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings the best out of you and develops well-formed maturity in you. You know how hard it is to stand up for what's right when the waves and the difficulties of people going on around you are heading in the opposite direction? I can remember years ago when I was about 22, 23 years old. I was put in a situation where everybody around me was going one direction, and out of about 35 people or so, I was the only one that said, I'm not going to go that direction. And I caught so much heat from my boss at the time because I was the oddball. I was the only one that decided that for me, that path would compromise my integrity. So I stood up to it and I didn't bend. But let me tell you, the heat from people around me was pretty intense. Now, there's some people who, or at least some bosses, want to know what qualities that irritate employers a whole lot. There's an organization called the Burke Marketing Research Group that shares the 7 deadly sins of people that irritate bosses. Let me just share a few of them. Number 1 is irresponsibility and goofing off and doing personal business on company time. Think about that a minute. Think about the people in your own workplace that do things for personal reasons instead of doing what they're paid to do, which is really stealing from the boss because the boss is paying you to do your job. Number two is arrogance and ego problems and aggressiveness. Number three is absenteeism and lateness. You know, if you and I would treat our boss's business as if it's our business, I think it'll change an entire mindset on how we act and how we behave and what our work ethic is at work. Number four is not following company policy. I've seen some shows on TV where some of the employees bend the rules and they change the rules because they don't like the rules. Well, you know, you didn't set the rules. You didn't design the rules. So it's up to us as employees to follow what the rules are. Number five is creating an atmosphere of distrust. How many times haven't you seen people that are in your company or former employers that create a level of distrust by maybe gossiping about other people in the office? How about whining and complaining? You know how fast that can spread in an office? When I start whining about this person and complaining about that person instead of praising them and lifting them up. Again, this all goes back to integrity. How about the lack of commitment to complete a job correctly? How many people do you know who do a job just to get it done instead of doing a job with excellence? It's so hard to find people that do a job with excellence. Frederick Douglass wrote, "I prefer to be true to myself, even at the hazard of incurring the ridicule of others, rather than to be false and to incur my own abhorrence." Frederick Douglass, as you know, was very famous in the 1800s. He decided to stand up for what's right all the time. And sometimes, to be honest with you, that costs you something. Integrity isn't free. It does cost you something. Cheryl Hughes wrote, "The truly scary thing about undiscovered lies," listen to this, "is that they have a greater capacity to diminish us than exposed ones. They erode our strength, our self-esteem, our very foundation." You know how hard it is? Let me say this a different way. There are people who lie so much that they lose track of the lies they tell, and then they have to remember who I told what to and when, and it's so much easier just to tell the truth. Joseph Stoll tells of a conversation he had with a pastor in Russia that back 50-some years ago, and he was talking about how even though in the most difficult times in his life, he chose to do the right thing. In fact, he said, when men refuse to compromise, when people refuse to compromise, they may lose much, but through them, God will fulfill his higher eternal purpose. I bet you can count on one hand in your life people that don't bend, that people will have integrity in the most difficult times. I can tell you flat out that sometimes that is really difficult because the temptation is to take those shortcuts. I can remember when I was a kid, probably about 14, 15 years old, my dad decided to take my brother and I out to the track at the high school. And at the time I was overweight and not in very good shape, so they decided to start running. My brother was always thin and energetic and in great shape. Well, he started running around the track, and I got tired about 5 minutes into the run, so I decided to run across the center of the track on the grass and beat them. Well, obviously that disqualified me because I cheated. I took a shortcut. It's kind of an example of what the lack of integrity does. You might think that you're winning, but in fact, you're losing. Acts 5 shares a story, kind of a radical story in the New Testament, because sometimes greed causes some people to bend away from honor and integrity. Again, greed sometimes causes people to bend away from honor and integrity. So let me share the story in Acts chapter 5. It says, "But a man named Ananias with his wife Sapphira sold a piece of property. And they kept back some of the price for himself and his wife's full knowledge, and bringing a portion of it, he laid it at St. Peter's feet." Now, the goal of that time was they were going to sell this property and donate the money or the profits from the sale of this land to the Christian organization that Peter was part of. So in verse 3 it says, "But Peter said, Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and to keep back some of the price of the land? While it remained unsold, did it not remain your own? And after it's sold, was it not under your control? Why is it that you have conceived this deed in your heart? You have not lied to men, but lied to God." Now verse 5. "And as he heard these words, Ananias fell down and died," just flat out died. The young men in the group, they got up and covered him up and carried him out and they buried him. And then the story continues that the wife came in moments later and Peter was asking her the same questions and she gave the same answer. Guess what happened to her? She died too, instantly. So when our priorities are in the wrong place, listen, when our priorities are in the wrong place, the tendency to bend into compromise gets pretty easy. Let me say that again. When our priorities are in the wrong place, the tendency to bend into compromise gets pretty easy. Albert Einstein wrote one time, he says, "Whoever is careless with the truth," listen to this, "whoever is careless with the truth in small matters cannot be trusted with important matters." So you think these little white lies are little white lies. They're not white lies. They're substantial. It's a big deal, is what I'm saying. So for you and I not to understand that what we do in addition to what we say matters, I think we need to rethink that because it really does matter in the long run. There's a story that Chuck Swindoll shared. He says, "Men who trap animals in Africa for zoos in America say that one of the hardest animals to catch is the ring-tailed monkey." He says, "For the Zulus, of that continent, however, it's pretty simple. They've been catching this agile little animal with ease for years. The method for the Zulus use is based on knowledge of the animal. Their trap is nothing more than a melon growing on a vine. The seeds of this melon are a favorite of the monkey. Knowing this, you see, the Zulus simply cut a hole in the melon, just large enough for the monkey to insert his hand to reach the seeds inside. The monkey will stick in his hand and grab as many seeds as he can, then start to withdraw his hand. That's the problem. This he cannot do. His fist is now larger than the hole." Think about this a minute. "But he can't get free of the trap unless he gives up the seeds, which he refuses to do. Meanwhile, the Zulus sneak up and nab him." How many times haven't you and I maybe been faced with a situation that we just won't let go of the temptation that eventually is going to do us in? And I think all of us have been there at one time or another in our own lives. Over in the book of James in the New Testament, James was a disciple of Jesus Christ, and he saw an awful lot. He said this, actually a paraphrase of this text in James 4 says this, "What is causing the quarrels and fights among you? Isn't it because there's a whole army of the evil desires within you? You want what you don't have, so you kill to get it. You long for what others have and can't afford it, so you start a fight to take it away from them. And yet the reason you don't have what you want is that you do not ask God for it. And even when you do ask, you don't get it because the whole aim is wrong. You only want what will give you pleasure. You are like an unfaithful wife who loves her husband's enemies. Don't you realize that making friends with God's enemies, the evil pleasures of this world, make you an enemy of God? I say it again, that if your aim is to enjoy the evil pleasure of the unsaved world, you cannot also be a friend of God. Or what do you think the scripture means when it says that the Holy Spirit, whom God has placed within us, watches over us with tender jealousy? But he gives us more and more strength to stand against the evil longings. As the scripture says, God gives strength to the humble, but sets himself against the proud and the haughty. Let me repeat that last one there. God gives strength to the humble, but sets himself against the proud and the haughty. So verse 7 says this, "So give yourselves humbly to God. Resist the devil and he'll flee from you. And when you draw close to God, God will draw close to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, and let your hearts be filled with God alone to make them pure and true to him." So you know what? Sometimes doing the right thing isn't always the easy thing. In fact, I would suggest to you that most of the time, doing the right thing is not always the easy thing. But the right thing is always the right thing to do. Omar Bradley was a general in World War II, well respected by thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. He said this: dependability, integrity, the characteristic of never knowingly doing anything wrong, that you should never cheat anyone, that you would give everybody a fair deal. Character is a sort of all-inclusive thing. If a man has character, everyone has confidence in him. Do you know how many employers will invest in employees who have integrity, who have honor, who have respect for everybody else, especially their employer? So taking shortcuts at work and taking shortcuts at home really don't add up to you really going places in life. The temptation, listen, the temptation to bend with the current of pressure and mediocrity can be tremendous, especially like I shared earlier, how people can kind of pull you or try to make you do things that you know are not right. An eminent doctor successfully attended a sick child. A few days later, the grateful mother called on the doctor. After expressing her realization of the fact that his services had been that she needed to pay for what he did for her child. But she said, "But I hope you will accept as a token for me this purse, which I myself have embroidered." Well, the physician replied very coldly to the effect that the fees of his service must be paid in money, not merely in gratitude, he added. Presents maintain friendship, but they do not maintain a family. "What is your fee?" the woman inquired. $200 was the answer. The woman opened her purse and took from it 5 $100 bills. She put back $300, handed 2 to the confused doctor, then went home. What if he would have accepted the gift of the purse with the $500 in it, meaning that his attitude, his ego got in the way from maybe doing the right thing? Now, compromise happens, at least in my world, over time, from what I've seen around. Sometimes the failure to commit to do the right thing when you know the right thing to do is one of the first steps in compromise. Maybe a failure to recognize the temptations of compromise all around you, because again, it's really the truth. Compromise, or the temptation to compromise, is really all around you. And sometimes we choose to ignore the cloak, if you will, of the people in our lives that are trying to get us to compromise. Think about that a minute in your own life. How many people do you have in your own life that have a cloak, a coat, a mask, that are trying to get you to compromise and do things that you know that you shouldn't do? Forbes magazine had an article written by Amy Anderson. It says, "A word of advice on those who are striving for a reputation of integrity. Avoid those who are not trustworthy." I think that's a big deal. Avoid those who are not trustworthy. Do not do business with them. Don't make excuses for them, and do not allow yourself to get enticed into believing that while they may be dishonest with others, they would never be dishonest with me. If someone is dishonest in any aspect of their life, you can be guaranteed that they'll be dishonest in every area of their life. You can't even dismiss little acts of dishonesty, Amy Anderson writes, such as the person who takes 2 newspapers from the stand when they only paid for 1. Or after all, if a person cannot be trusted with the simplest matters of honesty, then how can they possibly be trusted to uphold lengthy and complex business transactions? I cannot emphasize enough how important integrity is. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1 in the Bible, a paraphrase of it says this: "We are so glad that we can say with utter honesty that in all our dealings we have been pure and sincere. You know how hard it is to find people that are pure and sincere? Because I would say most of the time, people aren't so pure and sincere. Consider in your own life that you're never above temptation. In fact, there's a text in the scriptures that says that my paraphrase is that if you're arrogant, you're going to fall on your face. But if you're humble, you won't. That's my paraphrase of that text. So George Muller wrote one time, he says, to learn strong faith is to endure great trials. Again, to learn strong faith is to endure great trials. I have learned my faith by standing firm amid severe testing. Oh man, that is difficult. I can remember when we were out on the water one day, and we were on a tour boat, and the waves were so bad. I have never gotten seasick in my life, and I've been out on the water several times over the years, but that day I was so seasick. I had to go in the center of the boat to try to get my equivalent, what's that word? Anyway, I was having struggles getting back on my feet. So I eventually had to focus my attention on the horizon instead of on the waves. So when I decided to focus on what didn't change instead of what was going on around me, then I was able to feel a little better and to get more focused. I wonder how many times you and I pay attention more to the people around us that are doing things that aren't so great versus the horizon or the standard or integrity or honor. There is another way to give you strength, is to give you strength not to bend in difficult times. And you always have to make sure that you feed yourself well, not only obviously with food, but mentally. I cannot overemphasize that enough, that it's really important for you and I to make sure that we feed ourselves mentally consistently, because if not, then we're going to rot from the inside out. And once rot happens, it's almost difficult, almost impossible to stop. James 4 says this again. So it says, so give yourselves to God, stand and resist the devil, it says, and he'll run away from you. That is oftentimes that sometimes you see people that seem to be bombarding you with temptation and difficulties and struggles, and it's like, will this ever end? Well, you know what? It probably won't end, but how you view and how you respond to the temptation and to the challenge of your integrity can make all the difference in the world. In the Old Testament, in 2 Chronicles, it says this, you will not have to fight this battle. Listen to this. Take up your positions, stand firm, and see the deliverance of the Lord. So I think you and I have to understand that we have to do our part. That is, if we just, go with the flow, it's not going to be pretty for you and I. Those people who make it in life swim upstream. They don't float downstream. So as I close here today, again, the book of Proverbs says this in Proverbs 10. He who walks with integrity walks securely, but he who perverts his ways will become known. I'm going to end with a story that I found the other day by Al Covino. As a high school coach, I did all I could to help my boys win their game. I rooted as hard as I could so they would win. A dramatic incident occurred, however, following a game which I officiated as a referee. I changed my perspective on victories and defeats. I was refereeing a game at a basketball game in New York and between New Rochelle and Yonkers High. The New Rochelle was coached by Dan O'Brien, Yonkers by Les Beck. The gym was crowded to capacity, and the volume of noise made it impossible to hear. The game was well played and closely contested. Yonkers was leading by 1 point as I glanced at the clock and discovered there are just 30 seconds left to play. Yonkers, in possession of the ball, passed off, shot and missed. New Rochelle recovered, pushed the ball up court and shot. The ball rolled tantalizingly around the rim and off, and the fans shrieked. New Rochelle, the home team, recovered the ball and tapped it in what looked like an easy victory. The crowd's noise was deafening. I glanced at the clock and saw that the game was over. I hadn't heard the final buzzer because of the noise. I checked with the other official, but he couldn't help me. Still seeking help from this bedlam, I approached the timekeeper, a young man of 17 years old or so, and he said, "Mr. Covino, the buzzer went off as the ball rolled off the rim before the final tap-in was made." I was in the unenviable position of having to tell Coach O'Brien the sad news. "Dan," I said, "time ran out before the final basket was tapped in. Yonkers won the game." His face clouded over. The young timekeeper came up. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad. The time ran out before the final basket." Suddenly, like the sun coming out from behind a cloud, Coach O'Brien's face lit up. He said, "That's okay, Joe. You did what you had to do. It was the right thing to do, and I'm proud of you." Turning to me, he said, "Al, I want you to meet my son, Joe." The two of them then walked off the court together, the coach's arms around his son's shoulder. So I end where I started in Proverbs chapter 10. Honesty lives confident and carefree, but shifty is sure to be exposed. I'm John Carver, and thanks for watching.